This is EAA Timeless Voices of Aviation interview with George Daniels. The date is Thursday, July 31st, 2003. The location is the Timeless Voices of Aviation Pavilion building on the EAA Convention Grounds in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. The interviewer is Zach Bothman, Timeless Voices of Aviation Program Coordinator. George, could you please state your full name and spell it?
I'm George E. Daniels, and that's George, G-E-O-R-G-E. E is the middle initial. Daniels is D-A-N-I-E-L-S.
What was your date of birth?
My date of birth was June the 23rd, 1935, so that means I just turned 68 years of age.
Where were you born?
I was born in Bedford, England.
And what is your present address?
I presently live in Collingwood, Ontario, Canada at 47 4th Street East, Collingwood, Ontario. Zip code is L9Y1T2, Canada.
Okay. George, could you talk briefly about your childhood and whatever aviation experiences you may have had as a child?
Well, certainly, Zach. What's very memorable to me goes back to really the very early years of the Second World War, when I was really just 4.5 to 5 years of age as Hitler invaded Poland. And at that stage we lived just on the outskirts of London, England, and the first sirens to signify the aircraft coming over to bomb London was my first experience of the Second World War, when we had evacuees come to the suburbs of London to a place called Rickmansworth, which is a very nice community, and my father was away doing some war effort at that stage, which I'll refer to later, and we billeted some kids that were older than me in our house. And we were very conscious of the start of the war. We knew the war was coming. Everybody was told that they had to be on the blackout, meaning we had to have curtains over the windows so no lights would shine at night. Air raid sirens would go off. We saw barrage balloons, which are great big, large balloons, go up to arrest and stop airplanes flying over London and bombing, etc. So those were some of my first experiences of aviation, and I have others.
As a young boy in the Blitz, were you afraid or excited? What were your feelings?
Well, I think when you're little, there's obviously a parental protection situation there, but you're also very curious. And there's another delightful aspect of youth that I can remember. You're basically fearless. You do not understand what's going on around you fully. So some part of it is an adventure. Now, for the viewers and listeners to this tape, I would urge you, if you haven't seen it, and you can get it from your friendly video store, is in 1988, one of Europe's best film producers made a movie called Hope and Glory, to the famous music of Land of Hope and Glory, and it's the story of the Second World War Blitz in London as seen through the eyes of a 7 or 8 year old boy and his colleagues. Well, not only is the movie very accurate as to what went on, the devastation of a bomb on your street when you've just gone off to school and all of a sudden you come back on the street and your house is no longer there, it's going up in flames, and everybody's standing around in absolute shock as all of the treasures of the family homestead are gone. And in the case of my parents, we lost all our furniture, we lost everything. This was long before the days of insurance as we currently know insurance. We didn't have insurance on home contents in those days that I'm aware of. You did on life, and you had a few things to do with health and all that sort of stuff, but you certainly did not on a broad base. So we lost all that, and we lost all that in the Blitz, and I had a young brother, and that movie, Hope and Glory, is very, very amusing in many senses. But it's also very poignant, and it's very significant, and it shows the how to survive. We were on rationing, we didn't have enough to eat, you made do with a lot of things, but also kids are resilient. And, a smashed out, bombed home can be the world's greatest playpen. And of course, I can remember as a kid, we'd go to school, and the Home Guard and the police, and the Home Guard, by the way, were all senior citizen men who were too old to go to war. They all wore uniforms, as your viewers may know, and they were sort of an auxiliary volunteer police force to help look after the community. And they would come into the classroom and, okay, boys and girls, time out now, and we're going to alert you to some of the dangers that are happening around you. And they would show us mortars, and they would show us bombs, and they would show us grenades, and they would show us parts of aircraft. They would identify the difference between a Messerschmitt and a different kind of an aircraft. And they would say, don't touch, don't do. Whatever you do, don't go near a puddle because it might be a bomb crater. Well, guess what? We're just kids, right? And all this is new fun toys that we don't have. So you see a smashed up this and you don't listen to them, and you go over and you pick it up and you look at it and you grab a shell, and then the inevitable happens is one of your friends goes and grabs it and it does blow up and either maims or kills the kid. And you're awake for a few weeks and you understand you better not do that. But then something else happens, and all of a sudden there's an aircraft fuselage, and you've been told you can't go to that aircraft fuselage, but boy, do they ever make a great fort. So those are some of the things we used to do. But that movie, Land of Hope and Glory, or Hope and Glory, is quite a poignant movie. But I can also tell you some other amusing things, and this is a true story, also made into a movie. When the war started, we were obviously on the outskirts of London, and it was now 1939, going on 1940, and my father was working for one of the largest engineering firms in England, and they were contracted to build runways. Here we go with aviation again. Runways in northern Scotland to the entrance to the Hebrides, which are significant for the Isle of Mull and Tiree and the Isle of Skye. And we all know the famous music, I'll be in Loch Lomond before ye, and all of that Scottish stuff. Well, Oban is a great port, and one of the things that Oban was well known for then and still is today is that in the spring of 1940 there was a freighter loaded with 50,000 cases of Scotch whiskey destined for the United States that floundered, literally foundered, off the island of Tiree, where we had then moved while my dad was the senior engineer building a runway for the RAF on the Isle of Tiree. And the reason they were building that there was because they knew that that was more protective for the RAF aircraft, because the North Sea was way to the east of there, and Germany's Luftwaffe, Hitler's Luftwaffe, would be flying over England, but it may not come to that west side of Scotland. So the RAF would be protected there. Well, now we have a ship loaded with 50,000 cases of Scotch whiskey, and of course the Scotsmen are a very frugal individual and very entrepreneurial, so they proceeded immediately to plunder the ship. And so several weeks later, I remember my mother going out into the garden, and we were good gardeners, and everybody lived off the land up there, and she went out to the garden to dig up some potatoes and found 3 bottles of Scotch whiskey in the potato patch. A couple of days later, one of the things us kids do, we would go into what is called a scullery over there, which is an extension of the kitchen where they would churn the milk to make the butter and the cream and all that sort of stuff. Things that we don't see today in the average household, but then we did. So our treat was to sneak into these sculleries, lift off the top of the milk churn, and scoop up with our hands the cream. And I remember one day lifting the lid, just about to start scooping off the cream, and I hear this voice behind me, "Hoot, boy, get your hand out of there." And the reason I had to get my hand out, because there was about 6 bottles of Scotch in the bottom of the milk hidden that came from the ship. So those are some of my memories. I have others.
Where did you go from there?
Well, from there, my dad volunteered to go into the military. So he was a military man, and I won't dwell on that at great length, but he did survive the war. He was a Second World War hero in the Royal Engineers of Montgomery's 8th Army, and he was a specialist in building bridges prior to the troops actually getting to a river. He went all through the North African campaign. We were raised in a military background, but as part of where did I go from there is I wound up going to over there what is called a private school. It's not or a public school. It's really a private school. And so therefore I was at the age of now about 7, 8, all that sort of stuff, in this boarding school in a place called Cheltenham, which is really in the middle of England. And there was a student body of about 250, and we lived in dormitories. Now the war is still on, and we were out of the way of the major air raids that were going on. We still had to be conscious of that occurring, and we had holidays, and like a lot of people in a boarding school, we got 6pence a week for tuck, which is candy and chocolates, and that was quite a bit of money in those days, 6 pence a week, and you could save it up. And I guess my first real aviation experience is I discovered little balsa airplanes, and I would make little balsa airplanes and glue them together, and I would get the kits, and I could buy a little kit for about 2pence, which is 2 pennies, and I could make an airplane, and it would take me about half a week, and I would sell this to one of my fellow students for 6pence to get his 6pence so I could go and buy more candy. And that's what I did. So, and to top that all off, this was before the days of transistor radios as we know them, but boy, could we ever tune into the world. We had crystal sets. I don't know, Zach, you're familiar with a crystal set, but a crystal is about the size of your little fingernail, and all you have to do is to mount it on a board, and you put the crystal in there, and then you get a wire, and you get a little antenna, and you can string an antenna. It can be 5 feet, 10 feet, but if you're in a boarding school, and you're sleeping in a bunk that's got a steel frame, and it's got a steel bed supports with your bedroll on top, all you have to do is to attach a wire to that bed spring frame, and it becomes the best antenna in Europe. So what we used to do is we would go to bed, and everybody said lights out, 9 o'clock at night. We would get in there with our bedrolls, and we'd tuck the blankets so they came underneath the mattress, pulled it into sort of a little tunnel, and we would be underneath the tunnels with our flashlights on our crystal sets, tuning in to Lord Haw Haw. Hello, this is Lord Haw Haw from Germany, calling all you people in England. Hitler is after you, you will not survive. And we're all saying, of course we will, Lord Haw, we're going to beat you and everything. So we would switch to the BBC Overseas Service, the European service of Nazi Hitler, and we would even get big band music from Glenn Miller, who was then had started the wave of the Americans that arrived in the United Kingdom in 1942. And so we started to get to know the American troops, and they had far more stuff than we had, and our own troops didn't care less about little English brats, but Americans were very, very friendly. And one of the things we do, aside from crystal sets, we would go for walks and be out on walks, and if we saw an American coming towards us, the first thing we'd say is, you got any gum, chum? And sure enough, out would come the package of Wrigley's gum, and we would get a couple of sticks here and a couple of sticks there, and now our 6pence had gone up from 6pence to 8pence, and we were kings. We really had a lot of grub. So that was some part of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, my dad got he was an engineer, and as you may or may not know, or your viewers may know, by 1947, Churchill had got tossed out of office, and England became very socialistic, and they decided to nationalize everything, and it was unfortunately not very successful. And basically by the middle of 1947, England was poorer than it had been even during the war. It was broke. And so my father decided he'd been transferred to the Middle East. He'd helped the start of all the pipelines in Palestine. Some of the things that your viewers would know today as the Palestine and Israeli, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia situations over there were just as challenging then after the Second World War as they are now. My dad avoided being killed. He'd gone all through the Second World War. He was nearly killed by the bombing of the King David Hotel in Tel Aviv in early part of 1947, so he said, to heck with this. if all this nonsense is going to happen, England's broke, we might as well go someplace where I can put my talents to work. So we got on the Royal Mail ship Aquitania, which was the Cunard line, a 4-stacker. It was the last of the big 4-stack boats. We sailed out of Southampton on December the, I think it was December the 12th or something like that, 1947. And we sailed to Halifax, and we went to Pier 21, which is the Canadian version of Ellis Island. And here we are now landing just before Christmas 1947, and I got off the boat and I used to talk like this because I had somewhat of an English accent, so I could say that and all this sort of stuff. So here I was in Canada now talking like a limey. And some of the first things that happened to me when we did get to Montreal, our destination, we were in French Canada, a lot of English people. The first thing that happened to me was I got my ears boxed by all the English Canadians because I was talking like this. Well, hello, Zach, how are you? You know, and I'm a farm boy from up north in England. So I got my ears boxed because I talked like this, so I stopped talking like that and I started to talk like this. But the next thing that occurred to me was I then got in scrapes with all of the French Canadians because I was English. They didn't care whether I was from England or English Canada or whatever. So we got into big fights and everything else, and I discovered the best defensive mechanism was to speak French. Et ça, c'est la raison que je parle en français à ce moment, comme les autres au Canada, et bonjour au Canada en français. And so I'm now bilingual, and that's what it takes to become a bilingual Canadian. And so anyway, here we are in Montreal. I went to Montreal High, and that was an all-boys school. So here I am back in an environment that was all-boys school. And aviation started to crop up then. We lived next to Cartierville Airport, which was one of 2 airports in the Montreal area. Your viewers will know of Dorval Airport, and they'll know of Mirabel Airport. Cartierville, over the years, has been the home of some of the most successful aviation manufacturers, such as de Havilland, Bombardier, Lockheed, etc. And it has it was an airport that was used as part of the Commonwealth Air Training Program in the Second World War for pilots. Well, one day, and I would have been probably at that stage of the game about 16, my brother, who was probably nearly 14, we're little guys on a fence looking in at all these airplanes at this airport, and we're behind the Cartierville Flying Club, and it's a nice Saturday afternoon, and this man sees us, and he's in a little airplane, and he comes over the fence and he says, "What are you boys doing?" And we said, "We're watching these airplanes, sir, and they look really nice." He said, "How would you like to go for a ride?" "Oh, we'd love that." So anyway, he ushers us in, and he had an Aranca C4. Now that's a side-by-side little plane, and in those days it had an 85 horsepower engine, had no brakes, had no electrics, hand start, the propeller, no tail wheel, it was a dragger, and no doors. So because we were small and he was a slight man himself, he piled the 2 of us next to him. There was a side-by-side, strapped us in, and we took off for a flight of about probably half an hour around Mount Royal. Montreal has got a mountain in the middle of it called Mount Royal with a great big cross on the top of it. It's a significant landmark in the city of Montreal. And we saw the St. Lawrence River, we saw all the houses, and we saw this, and we're flying around. And you remember, this has no doors, so it's like flying an open cockpit airplane. Well, I was just tickled with this. I thought this was terrific. And so here I am, 16. So I tried to join the Montreal Flying Club and tried to learn, and I could not get into, for whatever reason, an air cadet program. I was unable to pull that off at that juncture. But anyway, we'd go out to the airport and we would see this man. He would take us for some rides again. And anyway, some other part of it was, now I get a bit older, and there's another airport near Montreal called St. Hubert Airport, and it was a military base. And my father, again being an engineer, he was building and expanding this military St. Hubert Airport. And I worked there 2 summers as a student. Now, of course, a military airport, it's got all kinds of, and this was the early 50s by now. And so this was like 1950, 1951. So you still got remnants of Second World War trainers. Tiger Moss are still training. Cornells are still training. Harvards, or T6s as you call them here. There's all kinds of Harvards and T6s all over the place. So I'm seeing them all the time, and my job is I'm the water boy on this construction site. And I have a yoke, you know, which is just like you see in the European films, and 2 water buckets on either side with a scoop. And this is where my French came in. I was the only English-speaking person on the entire job site. So I had to continue to parler en français avec les autres tout le temps and help them quench their thirst. The following summer I worked on the same project as a carpenter's helper, and I'm still seeing T6s and all these trainers and all these airplanes. Now I'm starting to see DC-3s and bigger transports and all that, and I'm really hooked. I graduate from school. My dad gets transferred to a place near Toronto called Hamilton, Ontario. And Hamilton, again, had been the airport there, and it's a very flourishing one today. Incidentally, just today, it is the eastern Canadian and part of the northeastern part of the United States main airport of expediting Purolator, Courier, FedEx, United Parcel Service, etc., etc., and they fly into Hamilton. But I'm at university my first day, and sitting next to this guy, he says, "What are you doing after school?" I said, "Well, I don't know. We just got transferred here, and I've only been here a week, and I'm just starting my university course." He says, "Well, I'm going flying after class. Would you like to come with me?" I said, "Oh, that'd be just terrific." And the next thing I know, I'm at the Hamilton Flying Club. This guy had just got his private pilot's license, but he also, to make money, to get more flying time, he was putting up television antennas. So now it is the fall of 1953. And from a television broadcast standpoint, Canada had that had the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation with one signal out of Toronto only on Channel 6, or was it Channel 5? Channel 6 or Channel 5. But Channel 4 and Channel 2 out of Buffalo were booming in with NBC and CBS into the Toronto area if you had an antenna. So my real launch of aviation was helping this guy and one other fellow. We had a pickup truck, and we would put up, and we did this for 2 years, we would work like crazy and try and study and all this other stuff, and we would put up an average of 3 to 4 40-foot television antennas after school in the middle of the week to earn money to invest in going and doing flying time on an Aranca Champ. And I started to learn to fly, and in those days, in the fall of 1953, to rent an Aranca Champ with an instructor was $11 an hour dual and $9 an hour solo. Now a lot of people think, oh, that's pretty cheap. That was quite a bit of money in those days. It was a lot of money when you consider that the average weekly wage for a person was maybe in those days $100 a week, maybe $85, $100 a week. So that was a lot of money. But what we did, we would put up a 40-foot antenna for $40. We would buy the material for around $20, $25, and we would pocket the 15 to 20 would make profit between the three of us. And we would take that money and fire it right back into our airplane flying. I soloed in September of 1955 in an Aranca Champ.
What was that like?
Well, I had 9 hours of flying time. My instructor, I had two instructors. One was Reg Spence, and Reg Spence today is 86 years of age. He retired about 4 years ago with 40,000 hours, and he was famous in the Second World War as being the lead instructor for the Commonwealth Air Training Program that taught an awful lot of Canadians, Americans, Australians, Polish people from Europe how to fly. He was a stickler, and he was a stickler for safety. And his assistant flying instructor was a guy who had survived the Battle of Britain, had one leg shot off, and he was a second version of Douglas Bader, if you know the famous Douglas Bader story with no legs, although Ken Parr, and that was his name, he's deceased now. Reg took me flying 6 hours dual, and Ken took me for supposedly the next 3 hours, and I was just coming up to 9 hours. We were right at the very, very end of runway 06 in Hamilton. and all of a sudden he said, pull over to the side and just throttle back a minute, I've got to do something. So he gets out of the aircraft, he closes the door and the window slid open. He said, okay, you're on your own, go. And I thought, wow, he's going to let me go. This is just terrific. So anyway, I poured the throttle to it. Well, I couldn't get over it. I think we had about half tanks of gas. I must have popped into the air in about 3 seconds. And I'm paying attention, but after about 50 feet, I wasn't paying attention at all. I just held the stick and just held her on a steady rate of climb, kept my climb speed at about 70, and I kept looking around at me, everything, and saying, oh my God, it's me. I'm here. You know, holy smokes, it was the most exhilarating, Zach, it was probably one of the most exhilarating feelings of my life. And you always, I think every pilot remembers when they go solo. And so that was my first solo. That was September 1955. I got my private pilot's license the following spring of '56. And I got that license at 36 hours of flying. And in those days, under Canadian regulations, you had to do at least 2 to 3 cross countries, one of which was dual, so they could see if you knew how to read a map and follow the yellow brick road, etc., etc. And 2 others under our air regs at that stage had to be solo. Well, it was winter time for my first solo, and I was going to a little place called Welland, which wouldn't be any more than about a 20-minute flight from Mount Hope, Hamilton. But it was the winter time. I'm in Aranca Champ. I'm by myself. It's cold. So anyway, I find the airport all right. The weather was bright and clear. It was beautiful. There was nothing in the way. There was no traffic. I did the usual typical uncontrolled airplane procedure over the airport, turn around, look at the windsock, determine which way the runway is. The guy had an Aldis lamp, you know, the green and the red, and stop or go. I looked for the Aldis lamp, but it was all green because they could see me. I get into the downwind. I make sure the carb heat's on. I'm 3/4 of the way down or halfway down the downwind leg on the runway, and all of a sudden the engine quits. So I thought, oh, well, this is rather interesting. Here we am, and I checked my airspeed and everything else, and I calculated out my glide, etc., etc., and I was prepared like you would on a standard, downwind leg, base leg, final approach. I was prepared to start descending on the base leg. Well, now all of a sudden I've got to descend. I've got to establish a rate of descent. So I did, and I landed the sucker and got her in there, no problem, and etc. So my first major experience in aviation was an engine failure on my on my first solo cross country with only about 18 hours under my belt. So that was the first thing. That was probably the best thing that had happened, because right then and there I understood and I really paid attention to everything to do with moisture in the air and maybe getting that blooming carb heat on long beforehand. So those were some of the things that occurred then.
So the year after, you earned your Canadian commercial pilot's license?
That is correct. In those days they had what they called a certified commercial license. I'm not so sure they have that way anymore. You could get a commercial license if you had over 200 hours and you wrote the exams, but you just had to build up the hours. But if you took what they called a certified course, that meant you had more dual, and in particular you had more link training time and you had more instrument time. And so I took the certified course. So I really got my commercial license at 165 hours. That's what it says in my logbook. I had 165 hours. This guy, Reg Spence, had to sign off at that. Now that was a very interesting next experience in aviation. I got to know this inspector afterwards fairly well. His name was Mo Louch. And every commercial pilot has gone through an in-air inspection test, etc., and you've got to do all kinds of things from stalls to, forced landings, etc., etc. Well, my forced landing, for those of you who know your geography, Lake Ontario and the Hamilton Harbor is the confluence of some of the best hydro lines coming out of Niagara Falls, where all the power is generated, not only for the States but for Canada. And the Adam Beck power plant, there's about at least a dozen big major electric towers coming north out of Niagara Falls, right over near the Burlington Beach Skyway, and then feed off power going east to Toronto and northwest up to Sault Ste. Marie. And so for about a mile or more, there's this spider web of hydro towers, etc. So this inspector, Mr. Louch, takes me and my super duper, now I'm in a Cessna 140, and I even know how to fly that on instruments, so we're in a Cessna 140, now doing my commercial test, and he pulls the throttle on me at 2,000 feet over the biggest mass of hydro lines you have ever seen in your entire life, and I have to find some blooming space to get this sucker down. Well, I did. Well, I don't think I sweated so hard in all my life. I found a patch to get down into, and he made me go down to about, I would say, well, I was damn near on flare out at 50 feet, and he said, okay, put the power to it, let's go. And I was nearly in there. And even then, climbing out, I had to make sure I kept that nose down. As I come out, I had to keep that nose down. Here's the hydro lines. I'm coming straight at him. At the last minute, I pulled her up to get up and over. So that was an experience getting that test, and I really, so I learned that one.
And then soon after,
Yeah, I got a job. I thought, well, this is really terrific. What was occurring, now it's 56-ish, and what was happening is the back end of the Second World War aviation graduates, some of those people who had got with the airlines, either stayed with the airlines or they didn't stay with the airlines. They didn't like it in civilian life, sitting in the right-hand seat of a DC-4 or some big aircraft when they'd had the freedom of flying in the Air Force. So they didn't like it, so they quit. So what was occurring was a lot of the airlines were hiring, and they were getting people with not very high time, like myself. At that stage of the game, I got my license 165 hours. And I started to put in more. I got a part-time job ferrying airplanes, believe it or not, from Minneapolis, St. Paul. The first four-place Taylorcraft fiberglass covered aircraft ever made was made in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So we ferried some back from Minneapolis, St. Paul to the Southern Ontario area for various customers. So that was my first job. But I went on an Air Canada course, and I was one of 300 guys that went on an Air Canada course, and they really beat the daylights out of us for about 5 days in Montreal. They checked us out medically. We took exams. We did all kinds of things. We did link trainer stuff. They said they were going to hire 150 of us out of the 300. I scored 152. I did not make it. So here I'm all gung-ho, and I'm full of zip and vinegar, and I want to go fly, baby, let's go. I got a commercial pilot's license. So what I did is I wound up in the then Fort William, Port Arthur, and I went to work, and I was hired as one of the junior pilots for a guy who was known in the North Country in those days as the Flying Santa Claus of the North, Orville Weben. And he had a company called Superior Airways and Seven Enterprises. And basically it was a bush flying operation in northwestern Ontario and northeastern Manitoba. And that operation had contracts on the Mid-Canada line, the Pine Tree line, the Mid-Canada line, and not on the Dew line. The Dew line was further north. But the Pine Tree line, for those of you who know your railways and your geography, the Pine Tree line basically follows the Canadian National Railways line from north of Montreal all the way westward through Sudbury and up to a place called Geraldton, Nakina, Sioux Lookout, over to Winnipeg, Lac du Bonnet, and that then was a distance early warning radar system. And that was on about the 51st parallel, and then you went north a couple of parallels more, which was basically the junction of James Bay and Hudson Bay, and you had what they call the Mid-Canada line, and that was another series of radar sites, and they were staffed by Americans and Canadian military. And this company had contracts to feed those sites, to feed them supplies, whether it was maintenance equipment, food, personnel going backwards and forwards. Here we are at the EAA Oshkosh convention with a lot of John Deere tractors and equipment around here. I think I saw so many John Deere tractors and equipment. I flew in parts. They're great machines. We flew everything up there. And my first experience is Orville said, well, you're going to go up and see a Randy McDonald, and he's one of those guys that survived the Battle of Britain. He'll beat you up and really whip you into shape in time because you don't know anything, boy. You got 300 hours. You got to learn. So anyway, you're going to sit in the right-hand seat of a Norseman until we tell you to get out of there. So anyway, for those of you who know Norseman, for those of you who are music buffs, the Norseman is the airplane that Glenn Miller was lost in at the beginning of the Second World War over the English Channel. It was called the Nordine Norseman. It was powered by a 650 Pratt & Whitney engine, radial engine. It was a great bush plane. It was a great plane on wheels. It was a great plane on floats, and we had them on floats, and in the wintertime we flew them on wheel skis. It would take a good load of cargo. I forget today the exact weight we would take, but we would take half a dozen people in all their gear without any perspiration at all. And some little sidebar to flying a Norseman in the right-hand seat and learning what's going on. Aside from flying diamond drill rods, supplies, nurses, doctors, engineers, and doing mercy missions, we used to fly quite a few because the company had camps for fishermen and hunters. And we're in Sioux Lookout, which is immediately north of the United States border, and Duluth and Fort Francis, that area. So we would have a lot of people from the States come up to go hunting or fishing. They'd come up with, in hunting season, with all kinds of guns, gears, sleeping bags, cases of booze, and you name it. And I remember flying with this guy, Stu Alexander, and he's the captain, and I'm the first officer in this Norseman, and we pile them all on. And Stu would get in the, get everybody packed in, and then he would crawl over everything, and he'd get up in the pilot seat, and he would pause, and I'd get out of my seat, and we'd put a passenger there, and I would go and sit back, and we'd say to the passenger, you're going to get a really nice ride today, and you'll see the camp, etc. And I'll just sit back here and relax, and I'll be sitting there on the way back. You sit up there and enjoy yourself. Well, the Norseman had a wheel, and it was on a yoke, and it was on a push button, so you could push the button and then move the wheel over to the co-pilot seat so it could fly it. So Stu would get in there with the wheel, and he would look around and he'd say, yeah, I think that's the airspeed indicator, and that looks like it's a rate of climb indicator, and this thing says RPM. Oh, RPM, what's that? Oh, and then he would look down. By now, the passenger's looking at him as though to say, what have I got myself into here? Then he's sort of stealing a glance behind him to wonder what's going on. And all of a sudden, he'd push the button and he'd flip the wheel up and put it over into the passenger side and say, here, would you hold on to that for a minute? We're still tied to the dock, by the way. Nobody's untied anything. We haven't pushed off. But then he yells out, will you untie the airplane? So the guys out on the deck untie the airplane, and all of a sudden he spies this little booklet on top of the instrument panel, and he grabs it, and on the outside it says, how to fly on Edo floats. And the passenger can see this, and he says, oh, isn't that interesting? And he turns, and it says, oh, lower the water rudders. Water rudders. And by now, the passenger is just about going to leave. I mean, the passenger is getting up out of his chair saying, I'm getting the hell out of here, and everything else. And so anyway, he says, calm down, I know what I'm doing. Anyway, I then wound up pulling that joke a few times on some people, and in my aviation bag with my headset, I've still got the little booklet that they spruced up called How to Fly on Edo Floats, and I've done it the odd time. It's a great joke. So those are some of my earlier experiences up there in the bush. I've got some others, Zach. I don't know if you're interested in them.
I am.
Well, so I was in a Norseman. So the procedure then, and this was 1957, late 57, going into 1958. By the spring of 58, I knew northwestern Ontario fairly well, and I'd been around there. And again, for those of you who know your geography and hydrographic survey things, one of the situations that occurred back there in the late 50s is what is called the Great Divide, is that part of the watershed that in those days was flowing north into Hudson Bay And what the authorities did in conjunction with the United States and Canada St. Lawrence Seaway Authority, they were scared that as they opened up, and you may remember that in the late 50s, Eisenhower and Pearson and those guys, our Canadian Prime Minister, they opened the St. Lawrence Seaway, which was a big, big deal for shipping into Quebec and Ontario and Cleveland and Detroit, and opened up the Great Lakes significantly. Well, they were scared of lowering the water table in the Great Lakes, so what they did is they built a series of dams that were in that part of northwestern Ontario and northeastern Manitoba to divert the water from flowing into Hudson Bay and flowing southward into the Great Lakes to keep the water table up. So we had an opportunity to fly a lot of engineers and a lot of people and understand what was going on. Well, obviously we also had people who were moving around, and one day we had some openings for a pilot, and I'd been there quite a while, and I'd been there for over a year at that stage of the game, and we'd hired this new chap, and remember, I'm in my early 20s, and this guy was in his 40s, and he'd come with some former experience and was given an airplane right away, which was unusual for the company. And then you'd be flying with people, and you would hear that he was getting lost, and he would go off on an hour-and-a-half, 2-hour trip and come back 4 hours later. Well, we knew he was getting lost. So one day I'm in my airplane, and I'm flying this engineering team to a site that was probably about 2.5 hours away from our base north of Sioux Lookout, and we're airborne maybe about 15-20 minutes, and one of the guys sitting next to me, I'm flying my own Cessna 180 now, and that's a great airplane on floats, super duper airplane. We had them all stripped down, we took everything out of them we could that were just bare bones, so we were often flying to maximum gross or more. Very illegal, but anyway, we did it. We could fly that sucker with 400 pounds overloaded, and it would do it any time. Those 225 Continentals were marvelous. Anyway, this guy's looking, I can tell he's reading the lakes, and I've got a map sitting on top of the instrument panel and everything else, but I'm not looking there. I know where I'm going. We've got a UHF radio in those days. There was no such thing as an ADF. There was no, it was all VFR, and you had to know how to read a map and where you were going. Well, I wasn't bothering reading it. I'd done the blooming trip so many times, I knew it pretty well backwards. The particular day was almost CA view. It was gorgeous. And this guy's reading the lakes, and all of a sudden he says, "Do you mind if I read the map?" I said, "No, here, take the map." So he takes the map, and he starts reading it. And after about 15 minutes, he says to me, he says, "You know where you're going." And I said, "Well, I hope I know where I'm going. I've been here a few times, and don't you have confidence in me? I mean, that's what I'm supposed to do. Like, that's my job." You see? He said, no, you know where you're going." I said, "Yeah, I know where I'm going, and where we're going is where I've got to drop you off and your buddy here and everything else." And I said, "Why would you say that to me?" He said, "Well, I was flying with one of your guys," he said, "a few weeks ago. And he said, this guy, we were out flying around for about an hour, and all of a sudden he seemed lost, and he spies this Indian down on a lake in a canoe, and we land, we go up to this Indian, he chops the throttle, he pulls up next to this Indian in the canoe, and he says to the Indian, 'What's the name of this lake?' And the Indian, in sort of pidgin English, says, 'Have you got a map?' So he takes the map, he hands it to the Indian, and the Indian looks at the map, and the Indian says, 'Where are you?' And the guy says, 'I'm here.' The Indian takes the map, and he looks at it for a moment. He turns over the page, again, and he says, 'You're right here.' And the Indian knew where we were. We were right off where this guy thought we were, and it was just terrible. But I laughed my head off when he said that. Anyway, the guy was subsequently fired about 3 weeks later, and that's what happened.
What happened when you left the bush?
Well, I left the bush for a medical reason. We work 7 days a week in season up there. There's 168 hours in a week, and sometimes we were working 100 hours in a week, and I got ulcers. So for medical reasons, I decided, and the doctor said, "You've got to slow down." So what I did is I wound up going back to Toronto, and I got a job selling Cessna aircraft. And that was a fun experience. And I really had a great opportunity to bring in some airplanes into Canada, sell airplanes. That's when I really learned something about selling. I worked for Sanderson Ackfield Aircraft. If you go look in the records, you'll see that Jack Sanderson was a British air ace in the First World War, and told me an awful lot about super-duper flying when, for example, I didn't know the reason why an air officer in the First World War had a stick. It wasn't because they thought it looked good on his uniform. It was because it had to be part of the uniform, because when they got in the cockpit to go flying and the cocks of the fuel tanks froze above them, they had to whack it with a stick to get the bloomin' fuel going. So I learned those little things. Trevor Ackfield was in the Battle of Britain. So I flew with and was working with some guys, and we had a Cessna distributorship. So I was selling Cessna airplanes. I met a guy, and he said, you know, there's an air service for sale in Huntsville, Ontario, which is in the Muskokas, about 100 miles north of Toronto, and the guy who owns it is Tommy Douglas, who was a ferry pilot in the Second World War, and he wants to sell it. He wants to retire now. And by the way, Tommy was a well-known Canadian pilot from the Second World War and a bush pilot. And the Air Service had a couple of Stinsons, a couple of J3s, and he was just doing charter work. So my buddy and I bought Muskoka Air Trails in the spring of 1959. And the first thing I did was, I'd been selling Cessnas. I got a Cessna dealership. And Cessna awarded me a dealership, so to be a dealer you got to have a Cessna aircraft. So we got a Cessna 180 on floats, ICE, and then I set up a satellite flying school in Elliott Lake, Ontario. It was the height of the uranium boom, and all these miners and everything else up in Elliott Lake had nothing to do to spend their money on, and there wasn't even a movie house in Elliott Lake in 1959. But they've got all this money and everything else, so we fired up there a PA-11 on floats, a couple of Aranca Champs, took 2 guys up there, and we went from a standing start to 100 students in about 6 weeks. And so we ran a satellite flying school. I had the Cessna dealership, so I sold a couple of Cessna 180s up there in mining country. Everything was very, very successful, and boom, all of a sudden I get sick again with more ulcers. So I survived until the spring of *60, and I had them so badly that I had my stomach taken out a couple of times, and they grounded me. So now I'm forced to re-evaluate my career. I went to all of the management consultant folks. I could have gone and worked for your equivalent of the FCC and worked in a tower or done something that didn't appeal to me. I went and got hired in the media business by another pilot. This is where aviation comes in. 2 guys who had been prominent aviators in the RCAF in the Second World War. One was a hero at Malta, Bill Olmsted, and another guy called Tom Quigley. And so I learned the media business. I learned billboards, I learned television, I learned radio, I learned newspapers. And one of the things that I did as part of that in Muskoka Air Trails, we had a little local radio station, and we had a lot of tourists coming into our area. So I decided I was going to help the local radio station fly traffic reports as a fundraiser, revenue generator for them and also for us. So this was my first experience being a radio broadcaster. So here we are in the aircraft, and we're broadcasting traffic reports. So when I got to work in the media business, this stood me in good stead. So I was always involved with the media and aviation and following aviation, and I kept going back to try and get my medical. And after 2 years, I got a private pilot's license back. A year later, I got a limited commercial back. Then I got my full-fledged commercial license back in about 1965 or 66. But now I'm really established in the media game. So a very good friend of mine, Captain Mo Service, S-E-R-V-O-S, now deceased, but anyway, he'd learned to fly ahead of me, as did another guy who became an air captain. He got the dealership for selling Aero Commanders, and because I was now a salesman, I helped him sell Aero Commanders. So that was great, sitting in an Aero Commander and demonstrating those. So I kept my hand in, even though I was doing media. I was in sales to do with television and radio and newspapers and magazines and all that sort of stuff. So we're running out of camera time here in the story, but if we've got a few more minutes, in the early 80s, I had an opportunity to start my own media communications and advertising agency in Toronto with a buddy of mine from those Cartierville days when I told you earlier that I'd seen the airplane and everything else from Montreal days. So we started a little boutique media advertising agency. And out of that came a very interesting situation. Is in 1984, when we started, shortly thereafter, is I heard that JAT Yugoslav Airlines, which were flying DC-10s from Zagreb and Belgrade to Montreal and Toronto, and they were doing a round trip. They were flying them twice a week as a scheduled airline, but they had no North American advertising agency. They were also flying to Chicago. They were flying to New York and Chicago, and they were doing a combination of round trips from those two Belgrade, Zagreb airports, either to New York, Chicago, and return, and or they were doing a Montreal, Toronto, and then return. But they had no North American communication advertising agency. They didn't know how to do that. They've been a communist country, as you may know. They were famous for Tito. One thing that the people in Yugoslavia, and it's a pity that in the modern era we've heard what happened in the 90s with the breakup of Yugoslavia and the Bosnians and the Serbs and all the terrible things that happened in Kosovo and all that sort of stuff. But basically those people survived the Second World War and Hitler and a whole slew of nonsense because they were hard workers. And JAT Yugoslav Airlines today is still one of the few airlines in the world that's never had an accident. One of the reasons why it's never had an accident is a great aviation story, because they're all darn good mechanics. In other words, once they get a piece of machinery or they get something that works, they keep it working. So they really know how to do that. Well, anyway, I became their advertising agency for North America. And because of my linguistic prowess, I even learned a little bit of Serbo-Croatian, Dobar dan, Dobro već, and how to communicate with them. I got to know their chief pilot. I was up in the front cockpit of a DC-10 going backwards and forwards to Europe at least a dozen times in the 4 years I had the account. I was hosted by them, which was really quite nice. Tito's best villa in Dubrovnik. Dubrovnik is one of the oldest medieval cities in the world, and if you haven't been there and you like tourism, go to Dubrovnik. It's absolutely gorgeous. It was the city that repelled Napoleon for a year and a half. You go to Dubrovnik, it was a little town built for about 600 people. It houses 3,000. Anyway, outside the walls of Dubrovnik, there's a beautiful villa that looks like a really super-duper motel overlooking the harbor and everything. So they put my wife and I up there for a 5-day stay. I remember that in 1985. Gave us the treatment and everything else. That was a marvelous experience. Flew over in beautiful CAVU weather, the Alps, on the way back to Canada. Got some third seat time in a DC-10. Learned all the hard work that you have to go through in a DC-10. Those old DC-10s are not like the Airbus 340 and the glass cockpit and all those computers. You've really got to work that DC-10. So I learned that. The Yugoslavia went to all hell in a handbasket in late '88, as you know, so that account went. They grounded the airline. The country went all kibbutz. And it's like somebody up there likes you, and turned out that the Toronto City Centre Airport was looking for a communications agency and a marketing agency and somebody that understood something about aviation. Well, I had flown in and out of the Toronto City Centre Airport when it was called the Island Airport many times. I'd flown in and out of there in Fleet Canucks when Bob and Tommy Wong ran what they called the Chinese Air Force, were teaching people. I'd flown in and out of there selling Cessna aircraft. I remember the famous history of the Toronto Island Airport when it was called Little Norway, because in 1939, 1940 it housed a lot of the Norwegian Air Force that came over here to train and stay competent while the war was going on over their place. So anyway, in 1994 I became the marketing communication agency for the Toronto City Centre Airport. Got to know an awful lot of people, perspired the politics of the federal government looking at an airport, the municipality looking at an airport, the Canadian government downloading airport responsibility to the municipalities, which is a really tough thing. You might get an airport for $1, but all of a sudden you've got to raise the money to make it work. How do you communicate that, still keep the traffic going, still keep the number one customer, which was Air Canada Regional, going with its Dash 8 aircraft, which is nice and quiet when everybody's screaming and saying we've got an airport in downtown Toronto, we don't like those big jets. We didn't have big jets. We had all these nice turboprops that are quiet as can be. Out there on the Toronto waterfront, what the Airport Authority we engineered doing, we put all those audio monitors along the waterfront highways, the Fred Gardner Expressway and the Lakeshore, and what we discovered right off the bat, we had about 8 audio monitors. The all-day traffic on those expressways were noisier than the Dash 8s or any aircraft taking off or landing in that airport. And we became a member of the City Center Airports Association around the world, which includes Kuala Lumpur, did include Chicago's Meigs Field, includes the London City Center Airport. I got to go over to the London City Center Airport at Canary Wharf, get a super-duper tour of that place, understand how all that works, how they've got 18 airlines flying into the center of London from all over Europe. And so I really learned that small aviation stuff and helped it work and helped it happen. I retired in 1999 to Collingwood and got really involved with the Collingwood Classic Aircraft Foundation, and that started about 20 years ago. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for a great organization. We have a museum and an education thing. This Saturday, August the 1st, 2003, we're celebrating the 15th annual gathering of the Classics. We're probably about 1/100th the size of Oshkosh here, but we'll have over 227 old classics. We'll have over 5,000 people from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. in Collingwood, Ontario, CNY3, area code 705-445-7545, on the web, www.classicaircraft.ca. It's good, www.classicaircraft.ca. Great website. And this is George Daniels in Oshkosh. Zach, I really appreciated the opportunity. I hope I've motivated some people to stay involved with aviation. You only get out what you put in. I still try to put in. I'm still flying, still love it. And thanks very much, Zach.
Thank you very much.